If you were to visit the cobblestoned city of Münster in western Germany today, walking past the jovial university students and the pristine shop windows, you would eventually find yourself standing before the imposing Gothic spire of St. Lambert's Church. It is a beautiful structure, reaching towards the heavens as medieval churches were designed to do. But if you crane your neck and look up towards the top of the tower, your eyes will settle on something that does not belong. Hanging from the stone belfry, silhouetted against the gray German sky, are 3 iron cages. They are empty now, save for the occasional nesting crow, but they have hung there for nearly 500 years. They are not decorations. They are not symbolic art. They are coffins. They were built to hold the rotting, tortured bodies of 3 men who dared to declare themselves gods. They hang there as a warning, a grim, rusting testament to a year of madness that the world has tried very hard to forget. To understand how those cages got there, and to understand the nightmare that unfolded in this city, we must turn back the clock to the 1530s. We often think of the past as a stable place, but 16th century Europe was anything but stable. It was a world on fire. Martin Luther had recently nailed his theses to the door in Wittenberg, shattering the absolute authority of the Catholic Church. But Luther had unleashed something he could not control. He had told the common people that they didn't need a pope to talk to God. They could read the Bible for themselves. For the downtrodden peasants, the starving serfs, and the illiterate masses, this was not just theology. It was revolution. If the Pope could be wrong, then maybe the kings were wrong too. Maybe the landlords were wrong. Maybe the entire structure of society was a lie. Out of this chaos rose a group called the Anabaptists. In Greek, Anabaptista means one who baptizes again, which sounds harmless to modern ears, but in 1530, it was a capital crime punishable by death. The logic was simple. If you were baptized as a baby, you belonged to the state and the church. By baptizing themselves again as adults, these radicals were renouncing their citizenship, their taxes, and their loyalty to earthly kings. They claimed they answered only to God, and they believed something else, something dangerous. The apocalypse was not a distant concept. It was happening now. They believed the end of the world was mere months away, and that Jesus Christ would return to rule a specific city on earth. They were looking for the New Jerusalem, and in 1534, a charismatic dark-eyed preacher named Bernhard Rothman convinced them that the New Jerusalem wasn't in the Middle East. It was in the walled city of Münster. Münster was a rich prize. It was a bishopric ruled by a prince-bishop named Franz von Waldeck. It was a city of guilds, merchants, and wealth, surrounded by formidable dual walls and a water-filled moat. But inside, the city was divided. The working classes hated the Catholic clergy, who grew fat on taxes while the poor starved. Rothman, the town's primary Lutheran preacher, began to drift toward the radical fringe. He was a man of golden words, capable of whipping a crowd into a frenzy. He began preaching that the old world was burning and that equality was the only path to salvation. The poor flocked to him, but the match that truly lit the powder keg arrived from the Netherlands. 2 men entered the city, bringing with them the true gospel. The first was John Mathis, a tall, gaunt baker from Haarlem with a long black beard and eyes that burned with a terrifying intensity. Mathis claimed to be a prophet of the Old Testament, specifically Enoch, returned to earth. He was not a man of peace. He was a man of fire and sword. He preached that the ungodly should not be converted, but exterminated. Walking in his shadow was his disciple, a 25-year-old tailor named Jan van Leyden. If Mathis was the fear, Jan van Leyden was the charm. He was illegitimate, a wanderer, a failed innkeeper, and an actor. He was handsome, eloquent, and possessed a theatrical flair that would eventually turn the city into his personal stage. While Mathis screamed of hellfire, Van Leyden smiled and spoke of a paradise where no one had to work and everyone was equal. Together with Rothman, they staged a coup that was as brilliant as it was terrifying. It began slowly. Anabaptists from all over the countryside, hearing the rumor that Münster was the holy city, began to migrate there. They came with their wagons, their children, and their desperation. They flooded the market squares, listening to Rothman and Mathis preach from the balconies. The demographics of the city shifted. The conservative merchants became the minority. The radicalized refugees became the majority. The tension broke in early February 1534. John Mathis ran through the streets at night, howling that he had seen a vision of the wrath of God descending upon the city. "Repent! Repent!" he screamed, his voice echoing off the timber-framed houses. Panic, contagious and electric, swept through the population. Hundreds of people poured into the streets in a state of mass hysteria. Men and women threw themselves into the mud, tearing at their clothes, screaming that they saw three suns in the sky, a phenomenon known as a parhelion, but interpreted then as a sign of the Trinity, signaling the end times. In this confusion, the Anabaptists seized the town hall. They didn't burn it down, they took it over legally. In the elections that followed, facilitated by the intimidation of the armed mob and the sheer number of new converts, the Anabaptists won every seat on the city council. Bernard Rothman, the voice of the revolution, and Jan Mathis, the power behind the throne, were now in total control. The Prince Bishop, Franz von Waldeck, realized too late what had happened. His city had been stolen by a death cult. He retreated to his fortress outside the city and began to hire mercenaries. He sent word to the lords of the Holy Roman Empire, "The rats are in the granary." Inside the walls, the reign of the prophets began with a ruthless act of purification. On a freezing morning in late February, John Mathis declared that the city could no longer harbor unbelievers. The New Jerusalem could have no stain of the old world. He ordered that anyone who refused to accept the second baptism, anyone who refused to join their sect, must be driven out. It was a scene of pitiful cruelty. The wealthy burghers, the Catholics, the moderate Lutherans, and anyone who simply wanted to live a normal life were dragged from their beds. They were not allowed to take food, money, or warm clothing. "Get out!" the Anabaptist guards screamed, prodding grandmothers and children with pikes. "God has no room for you here." Thousands were pushed out through the city gates into the biting snow of the Westphalian winter. As they stumbled into the countryside, looking back at their homes, they saw the heavy wooden gates of Münster slam shut. Behind those gates, the city was now sealed. Those who remained were the true believers, about 7,000 to 8,000 people. But there was a demographic imbalance that would shape the horrors to come. There were roughly 2,000 men and over 5,000 women. John Mathis stood in the market square, the absolute master of the city. He looked at the shivering, fanatic crowd and declared that the law of nature was suspended. There was no more Holy Roman Empire. There was no pope. There was only Münster. But outside the walls, the Prince Bishop's army was gathering. Cannons were being wheeled into the mud. Pikes were being sharpened. A ring of steel was tightening around the city. Inside, the madness was just beginning. Mathis ordered the destruction of all archives and documents. "We have no need for contracts or debts," he announced. "We are starting the world anew." They burned the land deeds. They burned the loan records. For the poor, it was a moment of ecstatic liberation. The debt was erased. Then he turned his eyes to the churches. The statues were smashed, the stained glass shattered, the organs dismantled. Art was vanity, and vanity was a sin. But as the siege lines hardened and the food supplies were counted, John Mathis, the prophet of Enoch, began to realize that running a city required more than visions. It required miracles. And if God would not provide a miracle, Mathis would have to force one. He began to exhibit behavior that was erratic even for him. He would sit for days in silence, then burst into violence. The people watched him with a mixture of awe and terrifying dread. They were trapped in a cage of their own making, led by a man who was speaking directly to voices in his head. And watching from the wings, the young tailor Jan van Leyden waited. He saw the bishop's army growing. He saw the prophet's grip loosening. He saw the empty throne of a king, just waiting for someone with the audacity to sit in it. The trap was set. The doors were locked. The New Jerusalem was about to become hell on earth. Paranoia is a hungry ghost. Once it enters a house, it devours everything until only the walls are left standing. Inside the fortified city of Münster, as the winter of 1534 thawed into a grim and muddy spring, that ghost was feasting. The euphoria of the New Jerusalem was beginning to curdle. The initial rush of adrenaline that came with expelling the unbelievers had faded, replaced by the cold reality of a siege. Outside the double ring of stone walls, Prince Bishop Franz von Waldeck was not idle. He had recruited professional mercenaries, the feared Landsknechts. These were men of war, dressed in slashed, colorful doublets, wielding 6-foot Flamberg swords and heavy pikes. They dug trenches, erected earthworks, and positioned cannons pointed squarely at the city gates. Inside, the atmosphere shifted from liberation to terror. John Mathis, the Gonbaker turned prophet, was no longer just a spiritual leader. He was becoming a divine tyrant. He realized that to hold the city against the world, he needed total control over not just the souls of his followers, but their bodies and their possessions. It began with the community of goods. Mathis stood before the city hall, his black beard fluttering in the wind, and opened his Bible to the book of Acts. He preached that the early Christians held all things in common. Mine and thine, he declared, were words of the devil. If they were to be pure vessels for God's return, they must strip themselves of the sin of private property. Bring your gold, he commanded. Bring your silver. Bring your money. Lay it at the feet of the Lord. It was not a request. Deacons were appointed to go from house to house. They moved like locusts through the city. They ripped up floorboards looking for hidden coins. They tore open mattresses. They confiscated jewelry, heirlooms, and guild funds. All of it was piled into the central chancellery. For the true believers, The poorest of the poor who had nothing to lose. This was a moment of triumph. Finally, the rich were being brought low. But for the craftsmen and the middle-class converts who had stayed, it was a violation. One man, a blacksmith named Hubert Ruscher, made the fatal mistake of speaking his mind. Ruscher was a respected man, a giant of a figure with hands hardened by the forge. During a public gathering, he muttered that Mathis was deceiving the people and acting more like a king than a prophet. The whisper reached Mathis's ears. The reaction was instantaneous and horrifying. Mathis ordered Ruscher dragged into the market square. The prophet was in a frenzy. He screamed that Ruscher was not a man, but a demon in human skin. As the terrified population watched, Mathis grabbed a pike and in a fit of clumsy, divinely inspired rage, stabbed the blacksmith. But Ruscher did not die immediately. He lay groaning in the mud, bleeding out. Mathis, panting, ordered the man to be taken to jail. A few hours later, realizing that a living dissenter was dangerous, Mathis went to the cell, pulled out a pistol, and shot the blacksmith in the back. Then, to ensure the lesson was learned, he dragged the body back into the square and chopped it into pieces with a halberd. The message was clear: dissent is death. From that moment on, the silence in Münster was deafening. No one dared to whisper. The people walked with their heads down. They were trapped in a cage with Tiger. Mathis then turned his attention to the intellect. "There is only one book necessary for salvation," he declared. "All others are lies." In a great bonfire in the cathedral square, the Anabaptists burned the history of Münster. Centuries of city records, musical scores, literature, contracts, and scientific texts were thrown into the flames. As the smoke rose, blotting out the sun, the collective memory of the city was erased. The people were now severed from their past, existing only in the terrifying present of the prophet's making. But Mathis had a problem. He had promised the apocalypse. He had promised that God would descend and destroy the bishop's army. He had set a date, Easter Sunday, April 5th, 1534. As the date approached, the tension became unbearable. The starving citizens, living on rationed bread and religious hysteria, waited for the sky to open. They sharpened their farming tools into weapons. They prayed until their knees bled. They looked over the walls at the mercenary camps, waiting for the fire of God to consume them. Easter Sunday arrived. The sun rose. The birds sang, and nothing happened. The sky remained blue. The bishop's cannons continued to thunder. The mercenaries continued to drink beer and play dice in their trenches. God had not come. Panic flickered in the eyes of the believers. If the prophecy was wrong, then everything, the starvation, the terror, the execution of the blacksmith, was for nothing. The crowd gathered in the market square, their faces pale and questioning. They looked to John Mathis. Mathis was visibly shaken. His connection to the divine was fracturing. He knew that a prophet who fails to deliver is usually torn apart by his own flock. He needed a way out. He needed a grand gesture to prove his faith. Suddenly he fell into a trance. He shook violently, foaming at the mouth. When he stood up, his eyes were wild. "The Father has spoken," he shrieked. "I am to be the new Gideon. I alone will ride out and scatter the ungodly. I will smash the enemy as a pot is smashed against a rock." It was a suicide mission, born of delusion and desperation. Mathis believed that, like the biblical heroes of old, his faith would generate a force field that would repel steel and lead. He called for volunteers. Only a handful of men, perhaps 20 or 30 of the most fanatical, stepped forward. They armed themselves with pikes and swords. They did not wear armor. Their faith was their shield. On Easter afternoon, the city gates creaked open. Thousands of Anabaptists crowded the ramparts to watch the miracle. They expected to see angels descend with flaming swords. They expected the earth to swallow the bishop's army. Jan Mathis rode out first on a white horse, his long beard flowing, screaming insults at the mercenaries. The landsknechts in the trenches looked up, bewildered. They saw a tiny group of lunatics charging across the open field toward an army of thousands. The mercenaries didn't panic. They didn't flee. They simply stood up, leveled their long pikes, and waited. The collision was brief and brutal. There was no miracle. There was only the wet thud of steel into flesh. Mathis was skewered by a dozen pikes before he could even swing his sword. His horse was gutted. His followers were hacked down in seconds. The mercenaries, laughing at the absurdity of the attack, swarmed over the fallen prophet. They didn't just kill him, they obliterated him. They chopped his body into 100 pieces. They put his head on a tall pike and raised it high just out of arrow range so the people on the walls could see the rotting face of their eunuch. On the walls of Münster, a collective gasp sucked the air out of the city. The prophet was dead. The prophecy was a lie. God was not coming. The crowd began to wail. It was the sound of pure, distilled despair. Some threw themselves to the ground. Others looked at the open gate, terrified that the mercenaries would now pour in and slaughter them all. The revolution was effectively over. The bubble had burst. But standing in the shadow of the gatehouse, watching the massacre with cool, detached eyes, was Jan van Leyden. The young tailor had been waiting for this moment. While Mathis was the visionary, van Leyden was the politician. He was the actor who knew exactly what the audience needed. He saw the vacuum of power, and he stepped into it before the people could riot. He climbed onto a water trough in the market square. He was handsome, young, and radiated a golden confidence that Mathis never had. He raised his hands, and his voice rang out clear and steady, cutting through the wailing of the crowd. "People of the New Jerusalem," he shouted, "why do you weep?" The crowd fell silent, looking at him. "Did you think God would let his prophet die without a purpose?" Van Leyden asked, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "God revealed this to me. I saw it in a vision last night. Jan Mathis had to die." The people leaned in, desperate for any scrap of hope. "Mathis was of the spirit of Enoch," Van Leyden continued, spinning his web. "But Enoch was only the preparation. Mathis had to be sacrificed to wash away our sins of doubt. His death was necessary to clear the way for what comes next." "What comes next?" someone cried out. Jan van Leyden smiled. It was a smile that would cost the lives of thousands. "Mathis was the prophet," he proclaimed, "but the time of the prophets is over. Now is the time of the kings. God does not want a preacher anymore. He wants a ruler. He wants a David to lead his people against the Goliath outside these walls." He looked around the square, making eye contact with the terrified men and women. "God has told me," he lied, "that Münster shall be the terror of the nations. We shall not just survive, we shall conquer the world." The despair in the crowd transformed alchemically into fanaticism. They didn't want the truth. The truth was that they were starving and trapped. They wanted a beautiful lie, and Jan van Leyden was beautiful. Within hours, the city council was dissolved. The old constitution was thrown out. Jan van Leyden declared that democracy was an invention of man, but monarchy was the invention of God. He dissolved the Committee of Elders. He appointed 12 dukes to manage the city, all of them sycophants loyal only to him. He took control of the food, the weapons, and the women. As night fell over the traumatized city, the head of Jan Mathis rotted on a pike outside the walls. But inside, a new and darker nightmare was beginning. The mad mystic was gone, replaced by a narcissist with absolute power. Jan van Leyden retired to the bishop's palace. He looked in the mirror and decided that a king needed a crown. And not just a crown, he needed a court, he needed robes, and he needed a queen. The siege of Münster had just entered its most bizarre phase. The cage was locked, the key was thrown away, and the king of the cage was about to start his reign. Nature abhors a vacuum, but power loves one. With the manic prophet Jan Mathis chopped into pieces and displayed on a pike, the city of Münster held its breath, waiting for the collapse. The people expected the mercenaries to storm the walls. They expected the wrath of the prince bishop to descend and wipe them from the earth. But Jan van Leyden knew something the people did not. Sieges are slow. The prince bishop, Franz von Waldeck, was running out of money. His mercenaries were drunk, unpaid, and unwilling to charge into a meat grinder without a plan. The immediate danger had passed, leaving a gaping hole in the leadership of the New Jerusalem. Jan van Leyden stepped into that hole and filled it with pure, unadulterated theater. Where Mathis had been a creature of Old Testament fire, gaunt, screaming, and clad in black, Jan van Leyden was a creature of the Renaissance. He was 25 years old, blond, handsome, and possessed a voice that could seduce a stone. He understood that the starving, terrified population didn't need another ascetic monk telling them to repent. They needed a star. They needed a symbol of victory so bright it would blind them to the reality of their doom. His first act was to reorganize the city into a totalitarian state that eerily prefigured the dictatorships of the 20th century. He dissolved the city council, declaring that democracy was a human invention and therefore flawed. In its place, he appointed 12 elders, hand-picked loyalists who would serve as judges and administrators. This was a clever nod to the 12 tribes of Israel, giving his coup a biblical veneer. But the real revolution was economic. Jan van Leyden declared that in the New Jerusalem, money was the root of all evil. It was the tool of the oppressors, the bishops, and the kings of the old world. He ordered the total abolition of private property and currency. Sell all you have and give to the poor, he had preached. Now he enforced it. The citizens were ordered to hand over their remaining coins, their gold chains, their silver goblets, and their fine linens. Warehouses were established near the cathedral. The city became a commune. Locks were forbidden. Doors had to be left open day and night, symbolizing the trust and brotherhood of the believers. If you were a shoemaker, you no longer sold shoes. You made them for the community, and you received your bread from the central storehouse. If you were a mason, you reinforced the walls for God, not for a wage. To a modern historian, this looks startlingly like early communism. To the Anabaptists, it was the restitution of the primitive church. But in practice, it was a mechanism of absolute control. By controlling the food and the supplies, Jan van Leyden controlled the people. If you rebelled, you didn't just risk execution, you starved. While the people gave up their possessions, Jan van Leyden began to accumulate them. The confiscated wealth of the city, the treasures of the expelled Catholics, and the savings of the middle class did not go to the poor. It went to the state, and John was the state. He began to dress the part. Using the finest fabrics left behind by the fled merchant class, he commissioned tailors to create outfits of stunning extravagance. He wore crimson velvet, silks imported from the Orient, and heavy gold chains. He rode a white horse through the muddy, manure-filled streets, flanked by a bodyguard of young fanatics dressed in uniform colors. The contrast was grotesque. The people were eating rationed bread that was becoming more sawdust than flour, while their leader paraded like a peacock. Yet strangely, the people loved it. In their misery, they projected their hopes onto him. He was their avatar. If he looked like a king, then surely they were a special people. His glory was their glory. However, a king needs a victory to legitimize his crown. In late May 1534, the prince-bishop obliged. Drunken and overconfident, the bishop's mercenaries launched an assault on the city walls. They brought ladders and storming bridges, thinking the mad heretics would crumble. They were wrong. Under Jan van Leyden's command, the defense was organized and ferocious. The Anabaptists fought with the fury of the cornered. Women poured boiling lime and burning pitch onto the attackers. Men wielded threshing flails modified with iron spikes. The mercenaries were slaughtered in the ditches. The bishop was forced to retreat, leaving hundreds of dead in the mud. The victory was electric. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that God was with Jan van Leyden. The tailor was now a general. Emboldened by this success, Jan decided it was time to drop the pretense of being a mere prophet. He orchestrated a new revelation. One of the 12 elders, a man named Johann Dusenschur, likely acting on Jan's instructions, stumbled into the marketplace one afternoon, convulsing in a trance. He silenced the crowd and pointed a shaking finger at Jan van Leyden. "The Lord has spoken to me," Dusenschur cried. "The time of the elders is past. The New Jerusalem must have a king of righteousness, who will rule over all the nations of the earth." He approached Jan, who feigned surprise and humility. Dusenschur took a sword and handed it to the tailor. "You are the king of the new temple. You are the David who will slay the Goliath." And so, in a city surrounded by enemies, starving and isolated, a tailor was crowned king of the world. The coronation was a spectacle of madness. A crown was fashioned from the confiscated gold, a magnificent piece of jewelry adorned with rubies and emeralds. A golden orb was created, pierced by 2 swords, symbolizing his dominion over both the spiritual and temporal worlds. King John established a royal court. He appointed a chancellor, a marshal, and a master of the kitchen. He took over the bishop's palace and held lavish banquets for his inner circle, while the commoners outside gnawed on leather strips and grass. But a king needs law, and King John's law was terror. To enforce his will, he relied on his second-in-command, Bernhard Knipperdolling. Knipperdolling was an older, wealthy merchant who had been the original financial backer of the rebellion. Now, he was the king's executioner. He was given a massive, 2-handed sword, which he carried with him everywhere. He was named the Sword Bearer. The laws became draconian. Disobedience to the king was disobedience to God. Complaining about the rations was punishable by death. Sleeping during a sermon was punishable by death. The first major internal crack appeared when a group of mercenaries inside the city, former soldiers who had joined the Anabaptists, realized the insanity of the situation. They plotted to open the gates and let the bishop in. The plot was discovered. King John did not just execute the ringleaders, he made it a show. He gathered the population in the cathedral square. The traitors were bound to stakes. Jan van Leyden, dressed in his red velvet robes, rode his horse back and forth, lecturing the crowd on loyalty. Then, in a moment that solidified the horror of his reign, he personally beheaded the first traitor. But he wasn't a soldier, and he wasn't an executioner. He was a tailor. The first blow didn't cut through the neck. The prisoner screamed. It took several hacking blows to finish the job. The crowd watched in silence, terrified. Knipperdolling stepped in to finish the others. The psychological cage was now complete. The people of Münster were trapped. Outside the walls lay the bishop's army, ready to kill them as heretics. Inside the walls lay King John, ready to kill them as traitors. There was nowhere to run, and yet the human mind is resilient. The people adapted. They worked the communal fields within the walls. They sang hymns. They believed that despite the hunger, they were the chosen ones. They believed that soon King John would march out and the armies of the world would bow before him. But King John's ambitions were not satisfied with mere political power. He wanted to rewrite the moral fabric of humanity. He looked at the demographic imbalance of his city, the thousands of women and the scarcity of men, and he saw an opportunity to indulge his own desires under the guise of divine command. He began to preach a new, explosive doctrine. He argued that the old laws of marriage were papist chains. He looked to the Old Testament patriarchs, Abraham, Jacob, David, Solomon. They all had many wives. If they were the new Israel, why should they be bound by Christian monogamy? The king sat on his throne, swirling wine in a golden goblet, plotting his next move. He was about to unleash an edict that would tear the city apart and turn the New Jerusalem into a harem. The golden cage was built. Now he was going to fill it. Power penetrates. It starts with the public squares, moves into the marketplaces, enters the wallet, and finally, it kicks down the door of the bedroom. By the summer of 1534, King John van Leyden had conquered the government and the economy of Münster. Now he came for the family. The demographic situation in the city was unique and desperate. Following the expulsion of the unbelievers and the influx of religious refugees, the gender balance had tipped wildly. There were roughly 2,000 men capable of bearing arms, but there were more than 5,500 women. These were nuns who had fled their convents, wives whose husbands had run away, and widows of the revolution. In the twisted logic of the king, this was not a social problem. It was a divine opportunity. Jan van Leyden and his chief preacher, Bernhard Rothman, began to circulate a new, explosive theology. They argued that the New Jerusalem was a place of regeneration. They needed to populate the world with soldiers of Christ. Monogamy, they preached, was a restrictive invention of the Latin Church, designed to keep men weak. They cited the patriarchs. Abraham had Hagar, Jacob had Leah and Rachel, David had concubines. If the father of faith could take multiple wives, Rothman thundered from the pulpit, who are we to say it is a sin? In July 1534, the decree was passed. It was mandatory. Every woman of marriageable age must have a husband. Since there were not enough men to go around, men were not only permitted but required to take multiple wives. The reaction was not the ecstatic acceptance the king expected. It was a riot of shock and revulsion. For the women of Münster, who had initially joined the movement because it promised spiritual equality, this was a betrayal of the highest order. They were being reduced to broodmares. For the men, particularly the older, more conservative craftsmen who had stayed out of loyalty to the cause, it was a shameful scandal. Resistance, usually silent in the face of the king's terror, finally erupted into violence. A blacksmith named Heinrich Mollenhecke could take no more. He was one of the few who saw Jan van Leyden not as a messiah, but as a pervert wrapped in velvet. Mollenhecke secretly gathered a group of about 200 disaffected citizens, men who were willing to die to restore sanity to their city. In the dead of night, they moved. They stormed the town hall and the bishop's palace. In a stunning reversal of fortune, they managed to capture the king himself. For a few breathless hours, the fate of Münster hung by a thread. Mollenhecke had the king bound and under guard. The rebels barricaded themselves in the town hall, demanding the restoration of the old city council and the end of this madness. But Mollenhecke hesitated. He didn't execute the king immediately. He wanted a trial. He wanted justice. That hesitation was his death warrant. The majority of the city's fighting men, the fanatics, the immigrants, and the mercenaries on the king's payroll, surrounded the town hall. They were led by Nipperdalling, the brutal executioner. They laid siege to the building with muskets and cannons. The rebels were trapped. When they realized the general population was not rising up to join them, their resolve crumbled. The loyalists stormed the building. The king was freed. Jan van Leyden brushed the dust off his royal robes. His eyes were cold. He did not believe in trials. The slaughter that followed was the darkest day in the city's internal history. Mollenhecke and his ringleaders were dragged into the square. They were not given a quick death. The king wanted to ensure that no one would ever say the word no to him again. 47 men were executed that day. King John personally beheaded several of them, though his aim was poor, turning the executions into a butchery. The rest were shot or hacked to death by the mob. Their bodies were thrown into mass graves. With the resistance crushed, the law of marriage was enforced with ruthless efficiency. Deacons went door to door, hunting for unmarried women. Nuns who had spent their lives in celibacy were forced to choose a husband from a list of strangers. Girls as young as 12 were married off to the king's guards. Refusal was a capital crime. The social fabric of the city dissolved into a bizarre domestic dystopia. Houses were now shared by 3, 4, or 5 wives. The jealousy and infighting were rampant. The New Jerusalem became a city of screaming arguments. To manage this, the king issued new laws. The first wife held the authority, but any wife who quarreled or challenged her husband could be brought before the tribunal. And of course, the king led by example. Jan van Leyden did not stop at 2 or 3 wives. He eventually collected 16. Among them was the most beautiful woman in the city, Devara van Haarlem. She was the widow of the first prophet, Jan Mathis. Upon Mathis's death, Jan van Leyden had immediately claimed her. She was crowned queen. Devara is one of the most tragic and enigmatic figures of the story. She was intelligent, regal, and by all accounts, a true believer who was caught in the center of the hurricane. While the other 15 wives were kept in a sort of royal dormitory, Devara ruled alongside Jan. She wore gowns of gold cloth, furs, and jewels. She dined on the finest delicacies while the city began to starve, because outside the walls, the noose was tightening. Prince Bishop von Waldeck had stopped trying to storm the city. He had learned his lesson. Instead, he decided to starve the rats out. He built a continuous line of earthworks around Münster. He blocked the river. He burned the fields. Nothing went in, nothing came out. By the autumn of 1534, the food stocks were dwindling. The communal kitchens began to serve bread made of oats mixed with sand and lime to bulk it up. The horses were slaughtered for meat, then the dogs, then the cats. But inside the king's palace, the fantasy continued. Jan van Leyden knew that if the people had time to think about their empty bellies, they would revolt again. So he gave them a show. He turned the city into a theater of the absurd. He organized games, dances, and theatrical performances mocking the Catholic Church. He staged a mass where the host was made of cow dung. The people laughed, their gaunt faces twisting into rictus grins. They were drunk on fanaticism and hunger. The climax of this surreal pageantry came in October 1534. The king announced a messianic banquet, a Lord's Supper, for the entire city. Tables were set up in the cathedral square. The king and Queen Devara sat on a raised dais, draped in purple. Around them sat the king's court, the dukes, and counselors, and below them sat the 6,000 citizens of Münster, emaciated, dirty, and desperate. It was a scene from a nightmare. The king's servants brought out the last of the city's real food, beef, wine, and white bread. The king and queen ate. Then the servants moved among the people, distributing hard crackers and communion wine. Jan van Leyden stood up, holding a loaf of bread. "Take, eat," he proclaimed, mimicking Christ. "This is my body." The people wept. They adored him. In their starvation-induced delirium, he appeared to them as a golden god, shining in the autumn sun. But the horror was never far away. During the feast, the king noticed a soldier who seemed to be disrespectful, or perhaps he simply made a mistake in etiquette. The records are unclear. What is clear is that the king stopped the banquet. He pointed at the man. "He has not on a wedding garment," John shouted, quoting a parable. The king ordered the man dragged to the dais. There, in front of 6,000 people, eating their holy crackers, the king drew his sword and cut the man's head off. The head rolled onto the cobblestones. The body slumped. The king wiped his blade, sheathed it, and then in a moment that defies all psychological explanation, he began to laugh. He signaled the band to play. "Dance," he commanded. "Rejoice, for the Lord is in our midst." And the people danced. They danced around the headless corpse of their neighbor. Queen Devara watched from her throne, her face a mask of porcelain perfection, hiding whatever terror lay beneath. As the winter of 1534 set in, the gilded cage was locked tight. The snow began to fall, burying the city in white. Inside, the firewood was running out. The last of the grain was gone. The people began to strip the lead from the church roofs to melt into bullets. They began to scrape the whitewash off the walls to eat the animal fat used in the mixture. The king proclaimed that God would turn the cobblestones into bread, but the stones remained stones. The madness had reached its peak. The city was a hollow shell, filled with polygamous cultists, ruled by a murderous tailor, and surrounded by an army of iron. The only thing left was death. But the end would not come from the enemy outside. It would come, as it always does in such stories, from a betrayal from within. The hunger was about to break the spell. Hunger is a slow and terrible sculptor. It whittles the human form down to its most basic architecture, revealing the skull beneath the face and the ribs beneath the skin. By the early months of 1535, the city of Münster, once a bustling hub of commerce and faith, had been carved into a graveyard of living skeletons. The winter had been cruel, but the spring was worse. The snow melted, revealing the filth and the bodies that had not been buried deep enough. The Prince Bishop's blockade was absolute. Not a single wagon of grain had entered the city in a year. The New Jerusalem was hermetically sealed, a test tube where a horrific social experiment was reaching its terminal phase. King John von Leyden, however, remained untouched by the sculptor's chisel. In the bishop's palace, the storehouses were still guarded by fanatics who were fed extra rations to ensure their loyalty. The king, his 16 wives, and his inner circle of dukes dined on salted beef, smoked ham, and fine wines confiscated from the cathedral cellars. They lived in a bubble of opulence, a floating island of velvet and gold in a sea of gray misery. The contrast was not just unfair, it was theological blasphemy. The Anabaptist Revolution had been built on the promise of equality, that the beggar was equal to the bishop, that all goods were common. Now the king was fatter than the prince bishop ever was, while the children of God were eating the leather of their own shoes. The diet of the common people had descended into the grotesque. First, they ate the horses. Then the dogs and cats vanished from the alleys. Then the rats. When the vermin were gone, the people turned to the inanimate. They boiled old leather belts and boots to make a gluey, flavorless soup. They scraped the whitewash from the walls of the churches to ingest the trace amounts of animal fat used in the binder. They pulled up grass and weeds from the cracks in the cobblestones. And then the whispers began. Dark, terrified whispers. The neighbors were looking at the bodies of the newly dead with a hungry, feral glint in their eyes. Though no official order for cannibalism was given, the line between man and beast was blurring. In this atmosphere of silent horror, a voice of conscience finally spoke up, and it came from the most dangerous place of all, the king's own bed. Elizabeth Wandschurer was one of the king's 16 wives. She was not like Devara, the queen, who seemed to have hardened her heart to survive. Elizabeth was broken by what she saw. She looked out the windows of the palace and saw children who looked like aged gnomes, their bellies distended, dying in the gutters. She heard the wailing of mothers who had no milk. She could not reconcile this with the kingdom of God. One evening in late May, Elizabeth did the unthinkable. She asked the king for permission to leave the city. "The people are dying," she told him, her voice trembling but firm. "If you are the shepherd, why do you let the flock starve while you grow fat? Let me go. Let me tell the world that we are sorry." Jan van Leyden stared at her. To him, this was not compassion. It was treason. It was a crack in the mirror of his divinity. If one wife could question him, they all might. If the inner circle crumbled, the illusion would shatter. "You speak with the tongue of the devil," John whispered, his eyes cold and dead. He did not divorce her. He did not banish her. He ordered a public spectacle. On a bright, sunny morning in June, the king dragged Elizabeth Wancherer into the market square. He gathered his other 15 wives, including Queen Devara, and forced them to watch. He summoned the starving public. Elizabeth was forced to kneel on the cobblestones. She was weeping, begging for mercy, not for herself, but for the city. Jan van Leyden drew his sword. He was wearing his royal robes, trimmed with fur. He looked at the crowd, then at his wives. "This is the reward for disobedience," he screamed. "This is the fate of those who doubt the Lord's anointed." With a savage swing, he struck her. But John was a tailor, not a soldier, and his strength was failing from the stress of the siege. The first blow did not kill her. It maimed her. She screamed, a sound that tore through the silence of the square. It took him 2 strikes to sever her head. Then, in display of madness that froze the blood of everyone present, the king began to dance. He stomped around the headless body of his wife, singing a hymn, "Glory to God in the highest." He forced the other wives to sing with him. Trembling, terrified, sobbing, they sang. They sang to keep their own heads on their shoulders. The crowd watched in mute horror. They realized then that their king was not a savior. He was a monster. But they were too weak to fight him. The terror worked. The palace fell silent again. But outside the palace, the survival instinct was overriding the fear of God. In the shadows of the city walls, a man named Heinrich Gresbeck was making a calculation. Gresbeck was a carpenter, a pragmatic man who had joined the movement not out of fanaticism, but out of circumstance. He had watched the rise of the madness, the burning of the books, the polygamy, and now the starvation. He looked at his own limbs, thinning day by day. He knew that the armies of angels Jan van Leyden promised were not coming. The only thing coming was death, either by starvation or by the bishop's sword. But Gresbeck knew something else. He knew the city's defenses. He knew that the massive double walls of Münster were formidable, but they were not perfect. He knew that near the Kreuztor Gate, where the river Aa flowed into the city, the water defenses had been neglected. The mud had built up, making the moat crossable. He knew that the guards at that section were so weak from hunger that they slept at their posts or were dead already, propped up to look like sentries. He had a choice: die a saint in a city of lunatics or live a traitor. On the night of May 23rd, 1535, under the cover of a moonless sky, Heinrich Gresbeck made his move. He slipped away from his post on the ramparts. He moved like a ghost through the shadows. He reached the wall near the fishing ponds. Ideally, he would have surrendered to a patrol, but the Anabaptists shot deserters on sight. He had to jump. He climbed the parapet and leapt into the dark, muddy water of the moat. He swam silently, the stench of the stagnant water filling his nose. He expected a musket ball in his back at any moment. But the walls remained silent. The city was asleep, exhausted by hunger. Gresbeck crawled up the muddy bank on the other side, gasping for air. He was immediately seized by a patrol of Landsknechts, the bishop's mercenaries. They dragged him roughly toward their camp, expecting to hang him as just another heretic attempting to flee. "Wait," Gresbeck gasped, spitting out mud. "Don't kill me. I have the city. I have the keys." He was not hanged. He was taken to the tent of Prince Bishop Franz von Waldeck. The bishop was a tired man. The siege had lasted 16 months. It had bankrupted him. The Holy Roman Empire was losing patience. He needed to end this, and he needed to end it now. He looked at the shivering, emaciated carpenter. "Tell me," the bishop said, "why should I spare your life?" "I can get you inside," Gresbeck whispered. "I know where the water is shallow. I know where the guards sleep. I can lead you to the heart of the beast." A deal was struck. In exchange for his life and a share of the loot, Heinrich Gresbeck would betray the New Jerusalem. The date was set for the night of June 24th, 1535, Midsummer's Eve. It was a night usually reserved for bonfires and celebration. This year, it would be a night of slaughter. Inside the city, King John van Leyden remained oblivious. He was busy planning a new theater production. He was confident that the walls were impregnable. He told his followers that the suffering was a test, and that soon God would turn the stones into bread and the bishop's men into pillars of salt. But God was not the one preparing to enter the city. On the evening of June 24th, the clouds obscured the moon. A summer storm was brewing, the rumble of thunder masking the sound of marching boots. Heinrich Gresbeck stood at the edge of the moat, surrounded by a select strike team of 300 elite soldiers. These were the lost hope, men who volunteered for suicide missions. They blackened their armor with soot to avoid reflecting the light. They wrapped their boots in cloth to muffle their steps. Gresbeck pointed to the weak spot in the wall. "There," he whispered, "the water reaches only to the waist." They stepped into the black water. Inside the city, the silence was heavy. The few sentries on duty were leaning on their pikes, half delirious from hunger, dreaming of food. They did not hear the splash of water. They did not see the dark shapes climbing the brickwork. The betrayal was complete. The cage door, which had been locked from the inside for so long, was now being picked from the outside. As the first mercenary pulled himself over the parapet and drew his dagger, the city of Münster slept on. The king was in his palace, perhaps dreaming of his golden crown. He did not know that his reign was measuring its remaining time in minutes. The nightmare of the Anabaptist kingdom was about to end, but the nightmare of the reckoning was just beginning. The violence that had lived inside the walls was about to meet the violence waiting outside, and the collision would leave a scar on history that would never fully heal. The difference between a kingdom and a graveyard is often just a matter of hours. On the night of June 24th, 1535, as the summer storm rumbled over Westphalia, the kingdom of Zion had only minutes left to live. Heinrich Gresbeck, the traitor, had done his work. He had led the strike team of 300 Landsknechts, hardened mercenaries with blackened armor, through the stagnant waters of the moat. They climbed the brickwork near the Kreuztor gate like spiders. The starving Anabaptist sentries, weak and hallucinating from hunger, were silenced before they could scream. The gates were thrown open. The main army of Prince Bishops Franz von Waldeck was waiting. Like a dam breaking, thousands of soldiers poured into the city. The silence of the night was shattered by the roar of muskets, the clashing of steel, and the terrified screams of a population waking up to their doomsday. The battle for Münster was not a battle, it was a slaughter. The Anabaptists, despite their emaciated state, fought with the ferocity of the damned. They knew there would be no mercy. Women threw stones from the rooftops. Men wielded makeshift spears. But they were fighting professional killers who had been waiting outside in the mud for 16 months, nursing a grudge and a lust for loot. In the confusion, the king was nowhere to be found. Jan van Leyden, the man who had promised that angels would defend the walls, had retreated to his palace. But his frantic attempts to rally a defense were futile. The city was burning. The last stand took place in the principal market square. A few hundred surviving Anabaptists barricaded themselves behind a ring of heavy wagons, a Wagenburg. They held the mercenaries at bay with muskets in sheer desperation. The bishop's commander, seeing that digging them out would cost too many of his own men, offered a deal. "Surrender," he shouted over the din of battle. "Lay down your arms, and you will be allowed to leave with your lives." It was a lie, of course, but the Anabaptists, exhausted and seeing no other way out, believed it. They lowered their weapons. They stepped out from behind the wagons. The moment they were in the open, the mercenaries fell upon them. It was a frenzy of violence. The surrendered men were hacked to pieces where they stood. The streets of the New Jerusalem ran red with blood, the cobblestones slick with the gore of the saints. By dawn, the city of Münster was a smoking ruin. The experiment was over, but the bishop was not interested in the dead. He wanted the living. Specifically, he wanted the leaders. He wanted the men who had humiliated the Holy Roman Empire for a year. Bernhard Rothmann, the eloquent preacher whose voice had started it all, was never found. Some say he died in the fighting, his body lost in the piles of corpses. Others say he escaped, fleeing into the night to live out his days in obscurity. He simply vanished from history, a ghost leaving the haunted house. But Jan van Leyden, the tailor king, was not so lucky. He was found hiding in a cellar. Alongside him were his executioner, Bernhard Knipperdolling, and another senior leader, Bernd Krechting. They were dragged out into the light, stripped of their velvet and gold, and thrown in chains. The fate of the women was equally tragic. Queen Divara, the beautiful widow of Jan Mathis and wife of Jan van Leyden, was captured. She was given a chance to recant, to say that her husband was a fraud and her faith was a lie. She refused. She stood tall, retaining her regal dignity to the end. The bishop ordered her beheaded. She died as she had lived, believing she was the queen of the world. For Jan van Leyden, however, a quick death was too good. The prince bishop wanted to make an example of him that would last until the end of time. For 6 months, the king of Zion was toured around the region like a circus bear. He was displayed in the courts of neighboring princes. Nobles would come to gawk at the mad tailor. They poked him, jeered at him, and asked him where his god was now. Jan van Leyden remarkably did not break. He remained arrogant, joking with his captors. "I have made you famous," he told the bishop. "Before me no one knew who you were. You should be thanking me." It was a bravado that would be tested to its absolute limit. In January 1536, the traveling show ended. The prisoners were brought back to Münster for their final sentencing. The stage was set in the very market square where Jan had once beheaded his own wife, where he had staged his messianic banquets. A wooden platform was erected. A crowd of thousands gathered, the surviving citizens of Münster forced to watch, and dignitaries from all over the empire. The execution of Jan van Leyden is recorded as one of the most gruesome in European history. The bishop did not want a simple beheading. He wanted a ritual of purification. The executioners brought out pairs of heavy iron tongs. They placed them in a brazier of coals, until the metal glowed a furious, bright red. Jan van Leyden was tied to a stake. Nipperdalling and Krechting were tied to stakes on either side of him. The sentence was read: they were to be torn with the hot tongs for the space of 1 hour. The executioners were instructed not to kill them immediately, but to rip the flesh from their bodies piece by piece, cauterizing the wounds as they went to prevent blood loss, ensuring the victim remained conscious for the full duration. The torture began. The smell of burning flesh filled the square. History records that Jan van Leyden endured the first few moments in silence, biting his tongue, attempting to play the roles of the martyr. But as the minutes dragged on, as the red-hot iron tore muscle from bone, the facade crumbled. The king screamed. It was the primal scream of a man realizing that he is not divine, but merely meat. Nipperdalling, seeing the king's torture, tried to kill himself by strangling himself with his own collar. The executioner saw it, cut the rope, and tied his head back so he could not look away or escape the pain. For 1 hour the agony continued. The crowd watched in stunned silence. This was the vengeance of the old order. This was what happened when you challenged the church and the state. Finally, after the hour was up, the executioners heated a dagger. They plunged it into the hearts of the 3 men. The king of the cage slumped forward, dead. But the prince bishop was not finished. Death was too fleeting. He wanted a monument. He had commissioned the local blacksmiths to construct 3 cages. They were made of thick iron bands, riveted together. They were coffin-sized, just large enough to hold a human body, but too small to allow it to move. The broken, mangled bodies of Jan van Leyden, Bernhard Knipperdolling, and Bernd Krechting were hoisted up and stuffed into these cages. Jan, the king, was placed in the central cage, slightly higher than the others, a final mocking tribute to his rank. Then, facing the cheers of the bishop's supporters, the cages were hauled up by ropes to the top of the belfry of St. Lambert's church. They were chained to the stone tower, dangling hundreds of feet above the city. There they hung. The birds came first. The crows and the ravens picked the flesh from the bones. The people of Münster, rebuilding their lives in the ruins below, would look up and see the skeletons of their former masters swinging in the wind. They saw the rotting velvet of the king's robes fluttering in the breeze. Seasons changed. The flesh disappeared. The bones turned white, then gray, then crumbled into dust. The skulls remained for decades, staring down with hollow eyes at the city that had once worshipped them. The years turned into centuries. The Protestant Reformation continued to tear Europe apart, then settled. The 30 Years' War came and went. Napoleon marched through Germany. The World Wars reduced much of Münster to rubble. In World War II, Allied bombs destroyed St. Lambert's church. The tower collapsed, but miraculously the cages survived. They were damaged, dented, but they were not destroyed. After the war, when the people of Münster rebuilt their church, they made a decision. They repaired the cages, and they put them back up. If you go to Münster today, you will see them. They are still there. They hang from the Gothic spire of St. Lambert's, 3 dark, rusting shapes against the sky. They are empty now, of course. The bones are long gone, but they possess a terrifying weight. They are a unique monument in human history. Usually, we build statues to heroes. We build arches for victories. We do not build monuments to our madness. We do not preserve the instruments of our shame. But the cages of Münster are different. They are a warning. They hang there to remind us of what happens when a charismatic leader promises a paradise that requires the blood of the innocent. They remind us of how quickly a civilized society can descend into a cult, how thin the veneer of sanity truly is, and how easily the dream of a new Jerusalem can turn into a cage of iron and bone. The story of the Anabaptist Rebellion is over. The king is dead. The prophet is dust. But the cages remain, swinging gently in the wind, watching us, waiting to see if we have learned the lesson.